So let's continue on our studies of this book, Ideology by Terry Eagleton. Still on chapter one. I'm a couple videos in now, so I'm on video D, and I'm looking at kind of finishing up this, or pretty close to. And in this video, I want to look a little bit at Eagleton's discussion of Louis Althusser, the great French. He's a French Marxist thinker, sociologist, does a lot of work and a lot of stuff to offer us to think more deeply about ideology. All right, so so what's going on here? Um, yeah, like Althusser says something like this. Sure, in the notion of ideologies, yeah, no problem. We can still speak of true and false, right? We still talk about truth and false. So we're not remember that distinction that Eagleton pointed out in the sort of the history of the study of ideologies, namely that there was one side which he called the epistemological side, which was concerned about claims about the world, true, false, so a very sort of standard, an ideology makes claims about the world, and we can look at them like they're empirical claims. Empirical meaning the sense that you can look at the world and say, is the claim accurately reflecting the world or mirroring it? True, false applies there. And then you can still do that, right? It's not completely the case that you have to rule that out. However, but he doesn't think that that's really the main thing with ideologies. So the true false stuff is there. You can talk about it. It's not the key issue. What's the key issue is that ideologies really deal with how, not the what about the world, but the how we are in the world, lived relations, right? And not surprisingly, this comes out of a lot of existential thought, like especially somebody like Heidegger. He was all about, asking, how do we live in the world? And human beings live in the world quite differently, right? You are in a world. You're inside of a world, and you're also standing next to like a table or a chair. But are you in the same world as that table and chair? Are you in it in the same way? Does the table have a world the way you have a world? When you talk about your world, you might be talking about, oh yeah, my friends and my dog and my parents and or my kids or my favorite movies or things like that. Okay, so that's kind of how you would talk about your world. Well, the table's not going to talk about its world like that, if it can talk about its world at all. So it's not really, a table doesn't have a world of friends and things like that. And we would say that a table stands in relations to other objects. Sure, the table is on the floor. You're standing on the floor too. But there's much more going on in terms of your relationship to the world and all the relations that you have with that world itself. It's all quite different. You have lived relations. Okay, your dog can have lived relations too. My dog has friends. She's friends with a couple of the other dogs around. It isn't crazy about some of them, but really likes others. So there's a little bit of that. But I don't know if my dog has a favorite movie or things like that. So it has a kind of different world than a table and a different world than I do and whatnot. So think about like relations as, yeah, how you're in the world, how I live in the world as a part of one of the relations I have living in the world is being a teacher or a researcher or a professor, right? And no doubt you have multiple lived relations in the world. That's what ideology is about. It's about these lived relations. So a table wouldn't have an ideology, whereas we do, according to our friend here, Mr. Althusser. So how you live in a society. So it's not just anything, it's how you live in society. And of course, these lived relations are a big part of it. Um, so an ideology is a particular, a little more getting into sort of the nuts and bolts here. It's a particular organization or set of signifying practices. French thinkers, they love to talk about signifiers and signified and all these things and signs, right? The whole story of semiotics, right? But think about like a signifying practice sounds like a really complex term. It's actually not. It's really, these are just human activities that generate meaning, right? And somebody writes a short story. Well, that generates all kinds of meanings, right? Somebody creates a piece of music that generates meanings. when you read a novel, right? Yeah, sure, we can quibble about whether there's meanings in the novel or whatever, or what exactly is the novel prior to you looking at it. But certainly when when you read a novel, you have some sort of production of meanings going on. You're like, oh yeah, I get that, and makes you think about things maybe a little bit differently than before. So those changes that it causes in you, right? Those are kinds of productions of meanings, right? And novels can have huge impact. Works of art, think about great works of art that have an impact on the world. Didn't the Mona Lisa generate all kinds of meanings, get people thinking? Didn't Bach's music and or the Beatles or whatever? These works have huge consequences, and these are productions of meaning. So these are humans do all kinds of things that generate meanings. Like think about it. That's what we do all day. Is we're really generating meaning. You storm into the office, right? Everyone goes, well, he's okay. We get it now. He's in a terrible mood. Stay away from that guy. That's a human production of a meaning as well. Okay, so these signifying practices, this kind of huge set of all these practices that we engage in, these they constitute human beings as social subjects, right? They give us a place, right? And they make us into social subjects. They don't make you like a human being in the sense of like flesh and blood. He's not claiming that kind of stuff. But when you think about yourself as a social subject, right? You're somebody's brother or somebody's sister or whatever, and that's in a context, or somebody's child, somebody's parent. These are things that take place. These are relational properties, right? You can't be somebody's child without there being a parent, or at least there was someone who was a parent. And so a lot of these are lived human relations, and they make you into certain things as part of your identity. All right. And these signifying practices, they constitute us as social subjects. They produce these practices will produce relations, how we exist in society. They give meaning and all that. And they link us up, right? They do lots of things. They constitute us. And through this constituting of us, they're linking us to all kinds of dominant relations of production. Oh, you're a parent now. Okay, well, now all of a sudden you're legally responsible for your kid. And if you don't look after your kid, the state will come down on you for it. So you are now embedded in a kind of power relation where you're related to the dominant power, like the legal system, in virtue of being constituted as not just a human being, but a human being who has produced an offspring, and now you incur all these moral and legal responsibilities. So this all takes place within a great system of lived relations, and you are constituted and linked up in a dominant relation of production and power and all these kinds of things. That's what ideologies are dealing with. So the ideological dimension, again, yeah, we can talk about true and falsehood, but it has an affective. It shapes, right? It has effects on us. It's affective. It shapes us in a variety of ways. And so Althusser emphasizes the practico-socio over just the cognitive. And again, it's not just abandoning it. This kind of comes always to haunt people when they want to say, oh, I want to emphasize something else, but they don't really want to completely get rid of the empirical, right? Because then it just completely detaches from reality, and very few people want to ever have a theory that's completely detachable from reality, because then that can sort of lead over into gibberish. Okay, so Eagleton, remember, he's our guy here talking about all this stuff. He's saying, look, we shouldn't dismiss the notion. Like, so we're going to follow Althusser. Yeah, it's more along these lines on this side of that. Remember that distinction between the epistemological and the sociological that Eagleton articulated early in the study of history of the study of ideologies. So Eagleton is saying, okay, don't dismiss the true and false with respect to ideologies. And he points out a sociologist, Paul Hirst, who does that. And he's like, no, I don't want to do that, says Eagleton. Rather, let's think of ideologies in terms of a ratio, right? So you've got the empirical statements and claims that have the empirical propositions. Yeah, those are claims. They can be talked about in terms of true and false. and kind of like a worldview, right? Something where and he likens it, uses an analogy like a novel. And so he talks a little bit about, not surprising, he's a literary critic, so everything's going to come down to some kind of relationship to art, especially novels. But they're very helpful. It's a helpful thing to think about. Like what is a novel? Well, in the novel, everything is kind of subordinated to the narrative, right? Trying to tell a story, right? And you, as a novelist, maybe you're telling a historical story. So you've got, like a number of issues that will be empirical claims about the world or can be checked. Let's say you're telling a story about people on a boat, right? And if you're not going off into the realm of fantasy, you're going, and even in fantasy, you do have some things that are empirically based. If nothing has anything to do with empirical thought, it becomes totally wild and abstract and borderline unreadable. So it has to have some context. So let's just think of a historical novel. You have the narrative. Let's say you're telling a story about Napoleon or something, but you're writing a historical novel about maybe somebody who meets Napoleon or whatever. So your Napoleon will probably be quite similar to the historical Napoleon, but you might make up a few things about him, like that we don't know for sure. Maybe Napoleon liked ice cream or something, and you might build that in to service your narrative because the character meets Napoleon over, I don't know, some ice cream or something like that. And the issue here is that there are some empirical propositions that are going to be really true, false about Napoleon. They might be anchored. Yeah, those have to be true. Other ones will be a little wobbly, and I'm going to manipulate things to serve the narrative. So the narrative is primal, and the empirical propositions, some of them might be nice and firm and really historical, and some a little wobbly. But everything in the end is really serving the narrative. So in the worldview, the empirical propositions are probably pressed into the service of the worldview. So if you think about it that way, so with this in mind, think about people that are ideologically minded. In this sense, we would think about, like, let's say someone has, let's say, kind of a racist worldview, right? Or one that we would find, or bigoted or whatever. So they might say, and I'll just use some variables here so I don't upset anybody, but just to get the logical point home. Let's say there's a proposition Q, and it's said by this person Z, and Z says, "Oh, community X is a bunch of criminals." Okay. Now, you might think that's just a straightforward empirical claim. And you go, "Oh, wow, hey, Mr. or Z, you uttered Q, and I'm going to show you that Q is incorrect." Well, if it's just a straightforward sort of notion of an empirical proposition, and that's what the person is believing, like in the way they might believe, like the book is on the table or something like that, and you say, well, look, that's an empirical claim, and notice the book is not on the table, so you'll stop believing that the book is on the table. That's not really ideological. This is ideological because in this sense, if you say to Zed, well, look, here's a bunch of statistics, there's all these kinds of things that show you that, well, yeah, there might be a few criminals in community X, but that's not really statistically no more than in other communities, maybe a little bit more from time to time, a little bit less, whatever, fluctuates. So community X is not really distinct in its criminal rates. Lots of communities have that. There's no community that's perfectly crime free. And so, this is kind of ridiculous. Well, usually people that are ideologically driven, they can, and I put it in quotation marks here, they can preserve this notion of Q despite empirical evidence against it by going, yeah, well, what I really meant by criminal, they'll sort of redefine it, or they'll bring in other kinds of propositions, value judgments. Well, I never liked those people anyway, and every time I've dealt with them, it's been awful, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so you can see where this is going, that it's not really something that someone will necessarily drop when it's in an ideology. They'll preserve kind of the narrative. And don't we often say to people, look, you've just got a narrative you're trying to preserve, and there might be certain empirical claims that are involved. But no matter how many of your empirical claims, your narrative always takes priority, and you'll figure some way out. You'll reinterpret terms. You'll do all kinds of things to preserve your narrative. Now, this is not highly unusual, right? Scientists too will have a certain kind of view of the world, and just because there's a little bit of evidence that contradicts their view, they don't throw it out. Like, for example, at the end of the 19th century, there were lots of problems with Newtonian mechanics. Call that the Newtonian narrative. And people were noticing weird things about orbits, especially that of Mercury. And they had a hard time. Like Newtonian mechanics was not quite agreeing with observation. They predict something about Mercury and it'd be off a little bit. And so people started tinkering a little bit with the system to preserve the Newtonian narrative to try and account. And when they would get it to work, something else would go wrong. Well, as we all know, the story is that the narrative itself kind of went awry eventually, and we got a new narrative, a new scientific theory that was Einsteinian mechanics, right? So that was able to do all the work that Newton's theory did and account for the weird things that Newton's theory couldn't. So now, I don't want to drag, I don't want to press the analogy with science too far. I'm just saying that when you have a dominant kind of narrative, people will often try to keep that in place until it kind of hits a kind of breaking point. And so science is like that too. So this isn't unique. But this one here, the difference with this and science is this has all these kinds of evaluative and normative judgments in, which you really don't have in science, right? That's not quite the same. But anyways, that's probably a huge issue. We can talk about that another time. So, but again, back to Eagleton's point is that this affective dimension, the evaluative, the normative, is part of the complex. The empirical is part. So yes, you have the true false here. You have the evaluative normative over here. But the epistemological side, to go back to that old distinction, is subordinated to this sociological side. All right. So we've got that notion, right? That's what Althusser is kind of leading us. It's about lived relations. It's about kind of thinking about narratives, evaluations, judgments, constituting of us as subjects. Different ideologies might constitute us slightly differently, and lived relations could be different. And again, it's a particular set of signifying practices. If you change those practices, the meanings change and the subjects of what we are as a subject, not like physical bodies and things like that, but how we think about this stuff will change as well. So that's Althusser's point. However, the epistemological side is not absolutely completely subordinated or eradicated, because we can still talk about the notion of the narrative as a whole. Can that be true? And that's what I wanted to point out with the Newtonian example, is that whole narrative eventually collapsed, right? They tried to fix it and do all kinds of things, but eventually it collapsed. So there is a retention of a deeper notion of truth and falsity, when not just the empirical propositions that are sort of buried in the narrative and are subordinated to the narrative, but the narrative itself, we can start talking about it too as true and false. Now, this is a bit more difficult philosophical topic, because now we're starting to get into some of the subtleties of what do we mean by true, what do we mean by false, and we'll have a look at that in the next video. Stay tuned.